Dear colleagues and friends in the worldwide patristic community, first of all, I'd like to thank Patricia Siner, the president of AIEP, for inviting me to give a lecture at the YouTube channel of the Patristic Society. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to do this, and I hope that those who watch it will profit from my thoughts. Let me begin my first point, the introduction about Christianity and the history of philosophy, with a question. Did Christianity actually have an impact on the development of philosophy in the ancient world? I would like to reflect on this question in my lecture today. Usually we think this question the other way around, and mainly in two ways. Either we ask about the influence of ancient philosophy on Christianity, or we ask about the philosophical aspects of early Christian thought. In this line of questioning, the topic is usually discussed under the heading Platonism and Christianity, but there are also studies on the influence of the Stoa on Christian thought. The spectrum of answers is conceivably broad. The extreme viewpoints range from the idea that the ancient philosophical traditions highly influenced the emerging Christian thought and should by no means be underestimated, to statements in which Christianity and philosophy are more or less strongly distinguished from each other, or even brought into opposition with one another. The same holds true when it comes to individual Christian and collective Christian communities' ways of life. Here too the spectrum ranges from the widest possible separation of Christians from everything philosophical on the one hand, to the discovery of far-reaching philosophical traits in the individual as well as collective forms of life on the other hand. However, I do not want to deal with these questions in my lecture today, but rather change the perspective. Instead of asking whether philosophical traits can be discerned in the thought, life and appearance of the early Christians and the early Christian communities, I want to ask the opposite question, the same one with which I began. Can influences of early Christian thought on philosophy be detected? Before I turn to reflections about this question, it is necessary to clarify more precisely what I mean by it. Namely, I do not want to ask whether we can identify influences from Christian thought in philosophical texts of late antiquity. This is also occasionally asked about, and such influences probably did exist in detail. It cannot be excluded that the philosophers of late antiquity also read Christian texts, although the reverse process of reception, namely the reading of philosophical treatises by Christians, was incomparably stronger and can be quite clearly grasped in the sources. But I do not want to focus my attention on such source-critical questions. Rather, I would like to look at the development of philosophical thought in the Roman imperial period from a philosophical historical perspective, and ask whether we can perceive, as it were, in the course of the history of philosophy, whether Christian thought had an influence on it. There were topics where this was certainly the case. This is true, for example, in the development of the theories of the ontological principles in late antiquity. The long-lasting ancient thinking about the mediation of unity and multiplicity, which in Neoplatonism moved into the center of philosophical endeavor, has been fertilized by the Trinitarian speculations of the Christians, just as they used philosophical concepts for their theories. Or the question of the eternity of the world was discussed differently, since the Christians had decidedly opted for its transitoriness. And the third example, it is generally acknowledged that Augustine's contributions to the concept of time and to the notion of a will, constitute decisive landmarks in philosophical reflection on these topics. In such areas, one cannot describe the history of philosophy without considering the contribution of Christian thought therein. Whether this is always done appropriately is a question that leads me to the topic that shall be in the center of my lecture. I would like to draw your attention to a development that took place in ancient intellectual history between the middle of the 2nd and the middle of the 3rd century CE. If I see correctly, it has not yet been noticed, but was of fundamental importance for the development of both Christian and philosophical thought. It is about the ancient thinking of freedom. There was an intense debate about freedom in ancient philosophy, but it was the Christian philosophers who first spoke emphatically of freedom when thinking about human decision and action. In this context, the Christian thinkers arrived at the new concept of freedom. They no longer only understood it as a topic of practical philosophy, but made it a principle of metaphysics. This leads me to my second part, freedom of decision in ancient philosophy. Since Plato and Aristotle, there has been a broad discussion about the factors that determine human decision and action. In the Hellenistic period, this discourse was mainly influenced by the terms and concepts of the Stoic theory of action, but all other philosophical schools also participated in this debate. In these discussions, when thinking about mechanisms and possibilities of human action, it was not about freedom. When Plato, in the myth of air at the end of the Politeia, and in other writings, especially in the Phaedrus, asked about the cause of suffering in the world, and attributed it to human beings and their choices of a way of life rather than to God, or when Aristotle analyzed the factors involved in a decision prohairesis, the question of whether the choice of a way of life or the decision was free did not arise. The Stoics were also not concerned with freedom, as is often misleadingly said, but with the possibility of ethical responsibility within the framework of a deterministic worldview. The founders of the Stoa, especially Chrysippus, besides Zeno and Cleanthes, attributed to man's reason the ability to assent to a conception, fantasia, imposed upon oneself, and to act accordingly, or to refuse assent, synkatathesis, and not to perform the corresponding action. Because of this ability to give or withhold assent, the Stoics saw the cause of some events in the world resulting from the decision of a human being, which is why they attributed responsibility for these events to him or her. The latter was the most important reason for this concept. The Stoics were interested in maintaining a human being's ethical responsibility for his or her deeds and misdeeds within the framework of a metaphysics constructed by determinate cause and effect relationships. This was Chrysippus' concept of compatibilism. The ancient philosophers of all schools were interested in assuring man's ability to make his own decisions in the face of omnipotent gods, an ominous fate, or physical causality. This may not be far from granting human beings a freedom vis-à-vis fate, the gods, and nature, or from understanding this ability to decide as something that is free. However, this is not how the ancient philosophers described it until the High Roman Imperial period. The very few exceptions I have been able to find so far are in the Jewish Platonist Philo of Alexandria and the Roman Stoic Epictetus. For the first time, the phrase prohairesis eleutera is encountered in a passage in Philo's writings where he refers to man's choice of the conduct of life, prohairesis tubiu, as free, eleutera. From the adjectives parallel to this, unbound, adesmos, and unfastened, lelumene, it is clear what sense the word free has here, namely to be free from external coercion. This corresponds to the original political social meaning of the word eleuteros in ancient Greece. However, Philo did not elaborate on this. The designation of decision as free is without weight in the context of the passage and rather rhetorical. But at least the wording of free decision was there. The early Christian philosophers moved it into the center of their ethical considerations. Other important impulses for the development of the concept of freedom in Christianity came from Epictetus. He, for the first time, stated that which is in us, the Stoic to ephemin, namely assent, is by nature free, physei eleuteron, unhindered, uninhibited. He also described the decision, prohairesis, as by nature free and unconstrained, eleuteron physei kai an anankaston. As with Philo, the political-social connotation of this concept of freedom is still clearly evident, even if by qualifying the decision as free by nature, Epictetus at least tended to detach freedom from political and social conditionalities. However, as much as freedom was at the center of Epictetus's practical philosophy, his notion of freedom was clearly different from the later Christian concept. This is evident from another passage in which he referred to decision as free alongside epithets such as unhindered and uninhibited. In the context of this statement, Epictetus used the Aristotelian term prohairesis by attaching a special sense to it. He did not mean that one specific decision among many others, or the decision-making capacity is free, but he used the term prohairesis to refer to a human being's personhood, his fundamental basic attitude from which he shapes his life. It is precisely from this fundamental attitude that Epictetus said in the passage in question that a human being should cultivate and perfect it so that it eventually becomes free, sublime over the perils of life, unhindered, uninhibited, trustworthy, and honorable. Thus, the freedom Epictetus attributed to a person's basic attitude did not mean that the decision-making ability is free. Rather, he described the goal a person would achieve if he or she perfected his or her basic attitude. Contrary to the statement that assent or decision is inherently free, the freedom Epictetus described was not one that comes to every person inherently. Rather, he was thinking of a freedom attained by those people who consistently use their decision-making capacity properly. These observations lead to my third point, freedom of decision in early Christian philosophy. Early Christianity built on these ancient debates, but introduced its own accent, which led to a reconfiguration of the notion of freedom. The early Christian philosophers were certainly inspired by the thoughts of Philo and Epictetus, but their reflections went far beyond what the Stoics in particular had thought. However, the revolution of thinking about freedom that took place there can only be noticed if one pays close attention to the terminology of the sources. By doing so, one can see that only the Christian authors emphasized the freedom of decision and increasingly moved it into the center of the philosophical considerations. We find the new Christian concept of freedom in all Christian traditions from the middle of the 2nd century onwards. Geographically, the sources that testify to it are distributed throughout the Roman Empire. The Syrian Tatian and Theophilus of Antioch in the east, Justin, Tatian's teacher in Rome, Irenaeus of Lyons in the west, where he had come from Asia Minor, and in Egypt, Clement of Alexandria. In addition to these Greek-speaking authors, there is the Latin Tertullian in Carthage, North Africa, and the Syriac-speaking world outside the Roman Empire, Bardisanes of Edessa. Thus, all the linguistic areas of early Christianity are represented, and along with them the great cultural areas of Greece, Rome, and Syria. The early Christian thinking of freedom did not originate from a certain cultural and intellectual tradition, but was present from the beginning in all regions where Christianity is attested in this early period. The main features of the Christian argument for freedom of decision are first found in Justin Martyr. In order to be able, like the Stoics, to ascribe to a human being the responsibility for his or her deeds, he emphasized against Stoic determinism that mankind, by virtue of free decision, prohairesis eleutera, has the capacity to avoid the ugly and to choose the beautiful. For if this were not so, it would not be the author of deeds of whatever kind. Here the expression prohairesis eleutera is encountered for the first time in a Christian text. Justin apparently felt so strongly about this freedom that he repeated it in the very next sentence. By virtue of free decision, man acts rightly or errs. With this, Justin explicitly and emphatically proclaimed the freedom of decision as formulated by his disciple Tatian, in whose discourse to the Greeks the phrase eleuteria tes prohairesios is attested for the first time in all ancient Greek literature. Theophilus, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, the latter two both spoke emphatically of the freedom of man, libertas homines, and likewise Bardisanes, agreed that this freedom was given to humans by God at creation. Most persuasive is a section in Tertullian's second book of his Apology against Marcion, in which he inculcates in a few chapters the freedom of decision, libertas arbitrii, man's free power of disposal over his decision, libera hominis potestas arbitrii sui, and similar phrases with great frequency. Once he emphasizes it so strongly that he speaks of the complete freedom of decision, tota libertas arbitrii, as well as of the own decision arbitrium suum, which is of course free, libes scilicet. Never before in antiquity had the freedom of decision been propagated with such intensity. In addition, there is another accent that also sets the Christian concept of freedom apart from the preceding ancient debates. Early Christian philosophers attributed freedom of decision to every human being as part of his or her creaturely endowment. Theologically, they justified this with the view that God had given this freedom to man at his creation, insofar as he is image of God according to Genesis, the famous verses in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Thus, freedom in the sense of freedom of decision was attributed to every human being as an a priori and an inalienable ability. Every soul always possesses, Origen stated, dominion over itself, and it is itself the cause of the decisions it makes about its path in life and its options for action. The universal dimension of the concept of freedom associated with it, which applies to every human being, is an innovation of Christianity. Why freedom of decision was so important to the early Christian philosophers is a question that can be pondered for a long time. Two reasons may have played a major role. First, these thinkers all opposed the deterministic views of the world and of human beings as they were imagined in great variety in the Gnostic systems of that epoch. In these systems, every human being was fixed to a certain moral quality and a certain religious destiny, namely to belong to the good or to the bad, to the redeemed or to the condemned. Against such cosmological and theological determinisms, the early Christian philosophers defended man's free capacity for decision and thus the possibility for change and enhancement or deterioration. However, they continued past this apologetic position and took the occasion to demonstrate the general possibility of free ethical action in this world. Secondly, a concrete life experience may have played an important role. In the conversion of people to Christianity, which was characteristic for almost all life journeys of the early Christians as far as we know from them, they experienced in themselves that a person can change and is able to make different decisions than before and to hold new convictions. From this experience of life, to come to the idea that every human being has the freedom of decision and is free in the determination of himself and his life, was not only not a big step, but a downright necessity. Therefore, the fact that Tertullian was the first author of antiquity to speak of and demand freedom of religion, libertas religionis, probably belongs in this context and should be understood in the sense that it concerned the free choice of religious conviction. Finally, early Christian thinking about human freedom was most likely fueled by biblical impulses. The term freedom does not appear in the Bible, with the exception of Paul's letters. However, the Bible in both the Old and New Testaments is full of liberation stories of many kinds that can be read as narrative pleas for human liberation from oppression, exploitation, marginalization, and every form of heteronomy. The Apostle Paul's theology of freedom can be understood as the first Christian reflection on what this freedom consists of and how it is achieved, to wit along the lines of the Old Testament, in that this freedom is a gift of God or Christ and becomes concrete in obeying God's commands. In this sense, the early Christian philosophers read the Pauline letters as an introduction to freedom. Along this line, Origen wrote his great commentary on Romans, in which the Apostle Paul is presented as a teacher of freedom against Gnostic determinism. To these considerations, one aspect must be added, which illustrates the complex interweaving between philosophical traditions and Christian convictions. Criticism of deterministic views of the world and of man, and especially of Stoic compatibilism, came increasingly from all other philosophical schools during the Roman imperial period. The Platonists in particular insisted on securing for human decision a real free space vis-à-vis the deterministic processes of nature or fate, the Stoic heimarmene. The first witness to this, as early as the 2nd century BC, is the academic Carneades, whose objections to the Stoics were echoed by Cicero in his writing on fate. Along this line of thought, all the imperial Platonists insisted that the person's decisions, which they described by means of the Stoic theory of action, must not be determinate. In this context, Cicero postulated a free will, libera voluntas, but did not explain in more detail how exactly this will is to be understood, nor in what way it is free. For the first time, the Epicurean Lucretius had already spoken of a free will released from fate, libera fatis avolsa voluntas, shortly before Cicero. He did this in the wake of his school founder Epicurus, who had already criticized Stoic determinism. But just as little as Cicero, Lucretius explained more precisely what one had to imagine by a free will. Also, in the imperial period, neither the Platonists, nor the Epicureans, nor the Peripatetics, who all criticized Stoic determinism, explained how the decision should be free of heteronomy. The concept of a free will introduced into the debate by the Latins Lucretius and Cicero was taken up by Latin authors only in late antiquity, and then developed into a new concept of the will, especially by Augustine. For the Greek philosophers, however, the pagan as well as the Christian ones, the concept of a will as an independent faculty in human beings played no role. In the background of this development in Christianity, there were certainly also the debates in the philosophical schools just outlined, but the decisive step towards the idea of the freedom of decision was taken first by the Christian authors. Now my fourth chapter, the Alexandrian recasting of the concept of freedom. Building on the emphasis of each person's freedom of decision, the early Christian philosophers even went a step further. They coined a new concept of freedom. This innovative step in ancient thinking about freedom took place in Alexandria. The beginnings of this Christian notion of freedom can be found in Clement of Alexandria. Following in his footsteps, Origen was the first thinker in the history of philosophy to establish a metaphysics of freedom, a generation before his pagan Platonist colleague Plotinus, who also did so within the Platonic tradition. As in the case of many other patterns of thought in the Alexandrian tradition, Philo was also a precursor of this Christian innovation. Indeed, in addition to his remark discussed above, that decision is free, he presented some other ideas that were received and further developed by the Christians. Philo referred to God as the Father of freedom, pater eleuterias, who created man as unbound, aphetos, and free, eleuteros, as well as a being which has the gift of a voluntary and self-impelling intellect, etelurgos kai autokeloistos nous, acts of its own accord, hekusios, and exerts its energies in accordance with its own decision and deliberate purpose. According to Philo, the godlikeness of the human being is based exactly in this. The early Christian philosophers used these thoughts, especially the foundation of the godlikeness of human beings in freedom, when forging their concept of freedom. Philo did not attribute freedom directly to God himself. For him, God was the Father of freedom, but this meant the freedom of human beings, but did so only indirectly by relating it to the godlikeness. This was directly and explicitly done by the early Christian thinkers. Irenaeus and Tertullian attributed freedom for the first time also to God. God is like man, a being of free decision, libera sententia, and therein the likeness of man to God is based. In origin, this idea led to the profound designation of God as uncreated freedom and to a concept of man as an image of God endowed with the ability to make free decisions, who should acquire the likeness to God, which is mentioned in Genesis 1, 26 and 7, next to the image, by means of this very freedom. The decisive step in the history of philosophical thinking about freedom was then done by the early Christian Platonists insofar as they completely reconceptualized the relation between nature and freedom. Like his fellow Christian philosophers, Clement of Alexandria criticized the Gnostic notion of fixed natures of human beings and became the first to formulate a categorical opposition between nature and freedom. Freedom, he argued, lies outside or beyond what is given by nature, as his opposition between ousia and exousia can be rendered. Freedom is understood by Clement as the opposition to everything that has a firmly delineated nature or a fixed sense. By ontologizing this freedom, Clement in turn placed the debate about freedom in a new framework. When a man has acquired the good or virtue by constant practice in such a way that it is unlosable, his inner attitude based on it becomes his nature. Through what he does, says Clement, his nature is formed. He creates and forms himself. Origen took up this idea, which was only briefly expressed by Clement, and developed a concept of freedom in which freedom is conceived as a principle of anthropology and metaphysics. He formulated the core idea repeatedly in his works. I will quote only two passages from the commentary on the Epistle to the Romans and the commentary on John, which are transmitted in different languages, Latin and Greek, but agree in content. According to Origen, the nature, natura, of each individual human being has been determined by the freedom of his decision, arbitrii libertas. And the Greek text, a human being is not in his essence, hypostasis, by virtue of the constitution in which he was created as he is, but because by changing, metabole, and deciding for himself, idea prohairesis, he has become so. And in this way, what he is has become his nature. Origen consistently conceived a concept of freedom in which it is not only contrasted with nature as in Clement, but even superordinate to it. The inversion of the relation between nature and freedom is thus found for the first time in the Christian Alexandrian tradition, preconceived by Clement and developed into a full-fledged theory by Origen. Freedom precedes nature. A person's nature, by which is meant the inner man, his moral state, is formed by his decisions in which he is fundamentally free. Whoever irrationally follows his drives and passions behaves like an animal, even if he remains a human being according to his physical form. Origen did not propagate the migration of the human soul into animal or even plant bodies, even though this was often imputed to him. Rather, he vigorously rejected the ancient metempsychosis. Whoever consistently decides for the good and constantly strives for the better becomes an angel. And finally, as the early Christians were not afraid to say, like God, according to the ethical quality of their inner attitude. In this concept of the superordination of freedom to nature, man is described as a being who determines himself, who makes himself what he wants to be by his own free decision. Man, unlike in the Gnostic anthropologies of the Roman imperial period, is not fixed to a certain nature, but is changeable and capable of development. Origen's greatest successor in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa, compressed this anthropology of freedom in the following statement. We are, in a sense, the fathers of ourselves, in that we bring ourselves forth as who we want to be, and by our decision form ourselves according to the model we want. Origen was also the first to attach human dignity to this idea of freedom. In antiquity, dignity depended on social status, on origin and prestige, on political position and influence. This is the language used by Cicero, who, however, at one point in De Officiis, grants man a dignity, dignitas, on the basis of his preeminence, excellentia, over animals, which is founded in reason. In the writings of Origen, we find the first evidence in which dignity is not tied to external position, but is accorded to every human being in view of his capacity for free self-determination. In the homilies on Joshua, in which Origen once spoke of the dignity, nobilitas, inherent in man, in connection with the manumission of slaves, the terms origin in the social and political sphere can still be seen. In the systematic writing on first principles, on the other hand, the term dignitas, dignity, is encountered in a sense decoupled from social position. Origen spoke of this dignity in connection with the interpretation of the statements about the creation of man in Genesis 1:26-7, again these famous verses. In the Greek biblical text, two terms are used in these verses: image, eikon, and likeness, homoiosis. However, after God's decision in Genesis 1:26 to create man in his image, like him, when it comes to the realization of this decision, Genesis 1:27 speaks only of image, but no longer of likeness. This difference has already been noticed by Clement of Alexandria. Drawing on him, Origen evaluated it effectively through his concept of freedom. Being created in the image of God was given to man by God, but the likeness he had to acquire himself by his ability to decide. Origen connected this idea with the dignity of man. Man received the dignity of the image, imaginis dignitas, at creation, but the perfection of likeness is saved for him at the end. He was to acquire this likeness himself by his own zeal through imitation of God. Having been given at the beginning the ability to perfect the image by virtue of the received dignity, he was finally to perfect likeness himself at the end by his own activity. Origen thus linked the dignity of man to the image of God, which for him is the main basis of existence of man, he pro hegumene hypostasis, as he wrote in the commentary on John, and therefore inalienable. According to this concept, God gives man the possibility, founded in being an image, to become similar to God. At the same time, God leaves him the dignity of his own assent, in that he does not immediately give him this similarity, but allows him the freedom to acquire it for himself by his own decisions and actions. This is for the first time a concept of dignity in which dignity is not bound to external characteristics of any kind, but is granted to every human being as a free being a priori. As with the concept of freedom, which underwent a universalizing reinterpretation in early Christianity, Origen also presented a concept of dignity with a new meaning. The early Christian and Alexandrian philosophers raised philosophical reflection on freedom to a new level. They made the political and ethical idea of freedom the ontological principle of anthropology and metaphysics. In this way, the metaphysics of freedom came into being, as it was also discussed a generation after Origen by the Neoplatonist Plotinus within the Platonic tradition. This metaphysics of freedom implied far-reaching changes in philosophical thinking, which I cannot elaborate here but only mention. A static metaphysics of being became a dynamic metaphysics of freedom. Reality is understood as a network of constantly moving and interacting entities which are in a continuous process of free self-determination. All further philosophical reflection on ontological principles will be shaped by this invention. Thus, the early Christian philosophers had a significant influence on the development of philosophical thought. Without their contribution, the history of philosophy in the Roman Empire cannot be adequately described. And with this, I come to my short last point on the philosophical reading of ancient Christian literature. The purpose of the considerations presented in this lecture is not to find a way out of the competing attitudes about the relationship between philosophy and Christianity in antiquity. There will always be scholars who want to keep the two as far apart as possible on the one side, and on the other side those who see Christianity as deeply influenced by philosophical thought. And there are numerous hybrids between these extremes. The relationship between philosophy and Christianity will therefore always remain controversial. What I am aiming at with my reflections is rather another level of discourse. However one describes the relationship between Christian and philosophical thinking in antiquity, the question that needs to be asked is whether the Christians, with their convictions and concepts of thinking, have influenced the course of the history of philosophy. Of course, the writings of Christian thinkers are not, as a rule, philosophical treatises. Only rarely do they devote themselves explicitly to philosophical topics, as for example Origen's systematic treatise on first principles, or Augustine's early writings, which are explicitly called philosophical dialogues. But the great mass of Christian literature belongs to other genres: apologies against criticisms of Christianity, controversial writings against heresies and heretics, commentaries on biblical books, homilies and speeches, plus letters and poems. Most of this literature is not specifically philosophical. Nevertheless, all of these texts repeatedly discuss questions and problems that are philosophical in nature or significant for philosophical contexts. The biblical commentaries and congregational sermons of Origen, for example, are not philosophical texts per se, and yet they are full of highly significant philosophical reflections and show strongly philosophical features in some aspects. These observations lead me to the plea I would like to make here. Even if the vast majority of ancient Christian texts are not philosophical literature in the strict sense, and were not intended to be so by their authors, we should nevertheless take them seriously philosophically. We should discuss them as critically and objectively as we do the ancient philosophical texts, and read them as a contribution to philosophy. The ancient authors, who already called their work Christian philosophy themselves, also wanted to be read as such. With their writings in the aforementioned genres, they participated in the ancient philosophical debates about God, human beings, and the world, and they brought new convictions and hopes into this discourse. In this way, they had a lasting influence on the development of philosophical thought. With my lecture today, I hope to have shown the fruitfulness of this approach using the example of the theme of freedom of decision. I would like to encourage the further pursuit of this approach to ancient Christian literature and its application to other genres and themes. This should be rewarding not only for theologians and philologists who work with patristic texts, but also for philosophers who do so rather little. I am convinced that there are many more insights to be gained in this field, which are informative for the development of ancient pagan and Christian thought. I thank you very much for your patience.